principles for managing suicidality in any patient who has this problem, regardless of their diagnosis. So there's 10 principles. They're not very complicated. The first of which is to just express concern. It's easy with people who are chronically suicidal to ignore or dismiss it as non-important. But just simply saying what happened, getting them to talk to you about it, it helps them process or metabolize what's going on and put it into some sort of clear order. That in and of itself is helpful and may relieve the suicidality just with that. Then you want to assess risk. You want to differentiate non-lethal self-injury from true suicidal intention, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. In general, in psychiatry, there are just these very consistent risk factors across studies. And even though statistical analysis has become much more advanced with much larger databases, even machine learning approaches can only have like about 70% accuracy, which is about the same as the usual risk factors that are included here. So stressful interpersonal events, substance use, increased depression, step downs from a lot of support to less support, like inpatient to outpatient, and access to means, lethal means. Those are things that increase risk for completed suicide across the board. For decreasing risk, showing support, positive interpersonal events, like having people in the hospital tell their family, oh, you know how you thought I was going to college? I actually am not going to college right now. These shameful disclosures may relieve pressure, and if their families don't reject them, that can actually decrease risk. Safety planning is a universal intervention for suicidality. Crisis skills, DBT skills, are not just DBT skills. They're just good, global, generalizable coping skills in the time of intense distress. Low-dose antipsychotics temporarily to relieve or take the edge off the intensity of emotions to help people think. It's not useful if it obliterates thinking. And then, as I said, hospitalization, temporarily, but not as a solution. So for adolescents, more so than adults, there are also the problems within their social environment. Families have problems. They're usually signs of families with stress, illness, or adversity of their own sorts. So parental abuse, financial problems, unstable employment, and parental substance use disorders. This will make their parents less capable of being supportive when the child needs it. Schools provide a lot of academic stress, especially for people who might have special learning needs. Peers, for those who are adolescent, they're just as out of control and unpredictable in a way, so this can lead to a lot of adversity through bullying or exclusion. And somebody asked me earlier to talk a little bit about the internet and social media. In a way, the kind of social pressures of the internet or the virtual world are worse than those in person, because you can bully someone without anybody knowing or without much consequence, because you can be more anonymous online. And so the self is constructed through these virtual interactions and may be, in fact, more fragile and more prone to insult and injury online. And there's also the problem of contagion or imitation by learning about these behaviors that other people are using. That's more prevalent among adolescents because their personality or their psychic envelope is more porous. They're just more prone to this than adults. And also sleeping problems. It's found in longitudinal research that even in infancy, sleeping problems predict BPD later. And even though insomnia is not a diagnostic criteria, it tends to be pretty common among those who have BPD. It's a sign of difficulty regulating one's sense of arousal to be able to go to sleep. So We also do a safety plan, and there's a certain order of a safety plan universally. It starts with what can you do to cope, things that you can distract yourself with. And this is something that comes from animal behavior. In the study of stress and its outcomes, biologists have found that rodents who can gnaw on wood in the face of stress are more healthy than rodents who have no coping mechanisms for stress. So being able to use distress tolerance or coping strategies to relieve the tension of whatever is stressful to them, that's the first level. Then interacting with others who can be supportive without talking about your suicidality. That's the one thing about people who have BPD, some of them tend to need to broadcast to everybody how they feel all the time. And this is something that, younger people do too. So, you have to teach people with BPD that this isn't the only way to get people to pay attention to you and support you. And it's actually better for the relationship if you just ask them out for coffee. But if that doesn't work, then you want to actually talk to someone who you trust about what's going on, maybe a parent, maybe a close friend, and try to get more support that way if the other two things fail. If that fails, then call a hotline or a professional, and if that fails, go to the emergency room. So there's like a kind of protocol that the patient is to go through, and it just takes time. Suicidality, like emotions, come and goes. And it just buys some time in which the patient can be their own agent in solving their emotional problem that feels so intense that they need to try to kill themselves. I'm going to skip the video in the interest of time, but what the video shows is engaging the patient as the person who has to take care of their own safety. People with BPD, because of their lack of self-confidence, they're just quick to give that responsibility to someone else. But we really want to engage them, even if you think they have bad ideas. Like they may say, oh, I'm going to pet my dog when I'm feeling suicidal. And you might think, really, is that going to work? But if they think it works and you show approval, it might work. It's your criticism or doubt or skepticism of it that might get in the way more because they'll be influenced by that. So giving them empowerment to kind of make their own plan. And then if it doesn't work, they come back and then you revise it. Oh, you found out that didn't work because your dog got very nervous around you when you were really irritable. So they may learn from experience that things don't work, and they will try to refine their safety plan over time. You want to identify the interpersonal stressors that got them to become so suicidal, and then address that after their arousal level comes down. And then you anticipate this will happen again, and you encourage them to add to their kind of list of early warning signs of suicidality and enhance their social safety net. What are the kinds of activities that you can manage during that time? And this is actually in our book. So you see the worry signs, the signs that I am getting overwhelmed, urges, physical sensations, then using these distraction strategies like painting or petting my puppy that should have like more than one thing on there. Social situations or people who can help distract me, people I can ask for help, and then people you don't ask. People who don't deal well with stress themselves, and then other resources. So the last thing is making the environment safer, which you can do this with adults too, but because adolescents are so impulsive, this is more helpful sometimes. So we try to educate people to think first, slow down. Allow your arousal level to come down so that your frontal lobe kicks in, and you may need to do different things to get there, like journaling, walking, counting to 10, breathing. These are things that we normalize. I generally tell people with BPD, oh, this is what I do when I'm upset about something. It's normal to try to cool off and think first. Get yourself in a situation you can think. writing pros and cons, the black and white sides of things that can help regulate and instate the frontal lobe. And just like tapping in and turning the awareness inward, that can also start to regulate the arousal level for young people. Tips, this is a DBT thing, but it's not just DBT. Changing one's temperature, hot or cold showers, intense exercising, breathing, yoga, lavender, whatever it might be, distraction, watching. I found that patients with BPD like really scary movies, like that I would never want to watch. They like those kinds of things because it takes your attention away. They can also use anti-dissociative skills, and one thing that is really helpful for people who are very distress prone and crisis prone is to give them a portable safety kit. You'll ask them to use these things together. So when I do exposure therapy for people who have had severe trauma, they have to carry around very potent coping kits. They have things like Tabasco, lemon sometimes, things that have strong sensations to them so that it can kind of center someone. So it's kind of like the same changing one intensity with another thing, like self-harm, but it's not as self-injurious, that helps people in those times. And if that doesn't work, you say, okay, let's try to kind of get you more connected. And you want to understand for the young person, what does that mean for them? So in this cartoon, the son says to his mother, I'm not coming for dinner, didn't you read my blog? They have different ways of communicating. Like my daughter, she never answers the phone. I say to her, I called you 10 times. She's like, why can't you just text me? And so you want to understand their best modes of communication and help them by adjusting to the way that they want to communicate. So if none of this works, you ask them, would it help to ask your parents for help? They can offer support, especially if we tell them how to do it, because what's intuitive for them may actually not be helpful to you, so we can work on that. Would it help to interact with someone else? What helps the most to take your mind off things? Get them to be active in thinking about them. And would it be useful to contact me or not? Think about it. So I generally ask people, like, it's not that you can't ask me for help, but do you want your safety plan to hinge on whether or not I have my cell phone with me? Or whether I'm giving a lecture and I can't answer the phone? Do you want your safety to depend on the likes of me? And John Gunderson, when he made this treatment, he never answered his cell phone. I don't think he even knew how to use it. So you know, a lot of DBT therapists, actually DBT was developed when there was no cell phone. So you had to call someone's landline and they had to be standing there in order to answer your phone call. So that kind of availability was never meant to be what it is today with cell phones. Okay. And the most important thing is involving the patient in their own rescue. So we say from this cartoon, we're encouraging people to become involved in their own rescue. So actually, I heard from a lifeguard, a professional lifeguard, that you're supposed to not intervene until someone stops moving when they're drowning. And I was like, wow, that sounds risky. But actually, when they're actively trying to combat the drowning, they have a better chance of helping themselves than you do. They might bring you both under. So you want to give them enough space to kind of start to engage in their own safety plan. But when they, you know, it's not like you're just going to stare at them, but it's that you want to give them a chance. And I often teach patients, you want to ask people verbally for the help that you want them to give you, rather than acting in a way that can be interpreted in a number of senses. And even in hospitalization, we say to people, I'm willing to hospitalize you despite my concern that it will not be helpful. It's a Band-Aid. So you don't want to get into a control struggle, but you express a conflict. I would do this because I fear that if I don't, you'll feel unheard and you'll become more suicidal. Am I right about that? You check with them. We would both be better off if we can find an alternative to managing this, right? And actually, the more someone develops a life, the more they feel this way. But if they don't have a life, they would rather go to the hospital. So that's why getting a life is really important. So when they do get hospitalized, you want to work with the team on the inside of that as much as possible to help them understand the patient and what will help and what won't. This will decrease unnecessary medications and lengthy hospitalizations. But what you can use the hospital for is some containment while you're working out a plan, when you don't feel like you can interact collaboratively enough to help a constructive path become more obvious. You want to sometimes evaluate the treatment and consider changes. Sometimes when someone is so distressed, that's the worst time to try to change anything, even if it's warranted. So you can use the containment to change medications and change therapies at times, or change the diagnosis. This is also another time that the social support system can be calm enough to think about what's going on and maybe change some of the things they do and learn from you. You want to address situational stressors. John Gunderson, in the beginning of the longitudinal study that he was the principal investigator of, CLIPS, he found that there were sudden, sustained remissions for about 25% of patients. And this happened in 6 months of follow-up. And it was usually some situational change. They got out of a bad relationship, or they changed something in their life that made them feel better. You also want to develop a plan afterwards so that when they return to the scene of the stress, they'll have a different way of approaching it. And you also want to broker difficult disclosures, like I've been using drugs or alcohol, or I'm in an abusive relationship, or I haven't been going to school, or something that they feel like they're already struggling too much. They can't possibly do have a conversation about something so difficult. So in the absence of intensive treatments for BPD, you may need to hospitalize someone just to temporize the situation. I'm going to skip this. This is kind of from the United States, but if you actually diagnose BPD, it gets you a higher rate of reimbursement from the insurance companies. So more importantly, though, it actually focuses on the problem. So the main intervention, once you have everything else situated, is to really understand what happens. We call this a chain analysis, but that's a fancy term for just understanding the events that led to the suicidal action. Assume that something happened in their relational world, and try to help them think about what they could do differently. And a lot of people worry that we're blaming the patient when we indicate that there's something that could have gone better, but it's really to empower them, because the best thing that they can control is their own behavior more than they can control other people's reactions. And the most important thing is that as a clinician, you want to avoid giving into countertransference urges to be heroic. When these patients are really connected, they're kind of intoxicatingly rewarding. They idealize you, and you want to be the person that can solve all their problems because it makes you feel like you're being effective. Who doesn't want that? But the danger is that when we all fall into this trap of feeling too much responsibility, that starts to kind of decrease the patient's level of responsibility or control. So the most dangerous thing you can do is pretend to be omniscient or omnipotent. So the last thing I'll talk about is contracting for safety. Do people do that here? No. Okay, so I'll skip this. You're ahead of us in terms of your intelligence. Better education here. And you want to understand this in the context. So when you talk to the patient about how they're becoming suicidal in the treatment, you just see it as part of the illness, but you also see it as a sign that what we're doing is not sufficiently working. And you don't want to take it personally, but you're just saying, okay, well, I'm supposed to be helping you with this, so there's something we can do better here. What are we missing? And then you want to also talk to your colleagues about it, because we're all prone to subjective blind spots. And sometimes just talking to a neutral party who's not as emotionally invested can help you realize things that you're not seeing or not dealing with. And we also want you to kind of implicate or involve the families, because at the end of the day, they're the people who are there, not you. And if you can enlist their support, they can be good partners in the project of trying to manage safety, even if the best they can do is not make it worse. Okay, so this is like a modern problem, but also a universal problem that, you know, you want to get them to get into agreements and contracts with you about how things work realistically. So you don't want to be too heavy-handed and too obsessional, but you also don't want to be too liberal and inattentive. So you want to give a young person increasing amounts of responsibility and negotiating power without the necessity of being threatening as a bargaining chip. Okay, so with a young person, you know, this says, under no circumstances will you be out after 8 p.m. That's a rest assured recipe for the young person not paying attention to what you have to say, and they'll just check it off and just move on. But you want to make time to listen. That's one of the most difficult parts of all of this, is that it takes more time to negotiate, talk about, and then follow through on things. That's the difficulty. And young people, because of their brain development, will not always play the tape forward in the way that you might think of it as a clinician or a parent. And you want to teach them how to ask for what they need and gain credibility to get it. So a lot of patients will say, I just want my parents off my back. And I'll just say, okay, that's a good idea. That's normal for a person of your age. How can you get them to believe you more? How can you increase your credibility? Yelling at them and threatening them into taking their car keys and then crashing their cars, obviously not going to work again. So you just point to reality to help them be able to make sense of life. Now, lastly, with family conflict, family involvement, you want to get families to cool down the temperature at home. Parents get into fights when there's a lot of pressure in the family system. You want them to alleviate the pressure on the family system through a lot of different things that we'll talk about, but you want to try to help them understand that their fearful, angry responses, which are normal, are just getting in the way of them achieving their goal, which is to regulate the situation. So you want to support them, but just tell them, okay, there are better ways you can do this. Be sympathetic. Their own difficulties, stress level, challenges, and self-esteem problems. As a parent, when your kids are having this many problems, you feel shame or insecurity, and you want to empower them and make them feel like, okay, this happens. People don't get a handbook on how to manage their adolescence with BPD, but you can learn, and you support them. But what they must do is get lethal means out of the way. If, you know, in the US, guns are a big problem. You want to always ask and advise them to keep those things locked and reduce access to medication and substances. And the parents will have their own coping plan. I'm not going to get into this, but it's in the book, that they will need their own strategies to be able to think first and be most helpful in those times. And then after a crisis occurs, you follow up. And you insist on this, because actually for a lot of people who have BPD, the suicidality or the self-harm relieves their stress level, and then they don't want to talk about it again. But you want to insist on it, because that's your job. That's your role. So you follow up, complete the chain analysis, actively interpret what happened, emphasize that they are the ones that are in charge of their safety, and they have to think of a reasonable safety plan that can improve. And you help them not only get relieved of the suicidal episode, but also reintegrate more confidently into their social environment. That's more regulating than any set of skills. Because when you go somewhere for trade, schools, apprenticeship, jobs, community like service like churches or whatever spiritual community, it gives you a time and place to be and a set of social rules and expectations that help regulate people. I think I'm going to skip this liability thing. You don't have the problems of liability here probably as much. Okay, so in the US, we're very obsessed with getting sued. So the last part is about that, but you don't have that problem here because you're better. Okay, so I will end here and we'll move on to the next section.